Dirty Moderates, many of you listen to this program know I love presidential history, both because I love history, but I also revere the institution of the presidency. And many of you also know, but many of you don't, I was born in September of 1974. The president at that time was Gerald R. Ford. Dick Nixon had resigned about a month before. Old Jerry Ford was thrust into the spotlight. And as it happens, I have been something of a Ford devotee and student. I've been fascinated by him, his time in Congress, and especially his short stint as vice president, and then his short stint as president, having never actually been elected president. And we are in great, good company today. And it is our good fortune here on the program to be joined by Richard Norton Smith, whose new biography, mesmerizing and fantastic, altogether compelling, and actually, I'd argue, essential reading for any student of history. It's called An Ordinary Man, The Surprising Life and Historic Presidency of Gerald R. Ford. Before I introduce him, I just want to say Richard Norton Smith is the director of 5 presidential libraries. He is, you probably have seen him on C-SPAN. I sure have. He is a very, very acclaimed biographer. Political junkies will love this. He has a book, Thomas E. Dewey and His Times, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He had a very acclaimed book called Patriarch, George Washington and the New American Nation. On His Own Terms is another biography of the great Nelson Rockefeller, who, as it happens, was Jerry Ford's vice president. And so, without any further ado, Richard Norton Smith, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words.
Of course. Thanks for this biography. So what I want to do is give you my sort of contextual overview and let you jump off from there. We can start at the beginning of the book or the end. It doesn't really matter because I think the arc is seamless when it comes to this subject. Jerry's life. I keep calling him Jerry as if I know President Ford's life. Nothing has, I think, devastated me more as a lover of the American experiment and as a pragmatist who accepts a two-party democracy. I don't love that we're two parties, but I accept it. Nothing really has devastated me more in recent years than the moral and philosophical collapse of the party of Lincoln into what I believe has become a party of no ideas, a party of social reaction, and a party wedded to a cult leader. And I'm gravely disappointed by that. I'm a dirty moderate because I have a lot of conservative principles. I don't identify with any party. I love having the choice of a viable Republican. I don't often get those choices anymore, and I don't think many of us feel we do. I mean, I don't live in Vermont where Phil Scott's governor or Charlie Baker was, or Larry Hogan, or, there's other Republicans I like too, but it's small pickings, slim pickings, and small field here. I think Gerald Ford, and I'm going to jump off with this, might have been, how do I say this? Because obviously it's a long time since Gerald Ford. He left the White House in 1977. Gerald Ford might be the last kind of quintessential Eisenhower, conservative shaded, pragmatic Republican. Is that fair?
That is fair. Okay. I think George H.W. Bush had elements of that, without a doubt. But he also found himself chasing the caboose of a runaway train. In many ways, a train headed to the right.
He was chasing Reaganism, which by that point had embraced evangelical conservatism and all that stuff,
That's right.
Yeah.
This book is bracketed by 2 revealing instances where Ford, in effect, was trying to redeem earlier oversights, is putting it mildly. Yeah. At the very beginning of the book, in the prologue, there's a scene in the spring of 1975 where Ford is presiding over a small stag dinner in the White House and drinks beforehand. And among his guests is George McGovern, the Democratic senator from South Dakota, whom Richard Nixon had soundly defeated just a couple years before. And McGovern was sort of head-scratching in an incredulity that he was there. And he said, Mr. President, Lyndon Johnson never invited me to the White House. Obviously, his critique of the Vietnam War being the cause. He said, and you can be sure Richard Nixon never invited me to the White House. And Ford replied, I know, George, that's why I asked you. The House belongs to everyone, now more than ever.
Yeah.
Now, that tells you a lot about not only Gerald Ford, but about a style of politics, which has clearly gone out of fashion. Because I was around, I was young enough, but I remembered, I was old enough to remember the 60s and the 70s were not exactly an era of good feeling.
No.
In Vietnam and Watergate obviously saw to that. So it isn't a kind of misplaced nostalgia that prompts me to write this book or talk about Ford as something worthy of nostalgia, if you will. The end of the book, the very end in the epilogue, I found a story that I thought was the perfect culmination that in many ways drew a direct line from the McGovern story. And it was just a couple weeks before the Republican convention, where at that point it was by no means certain that Ford was going to defeat Ronald Reagan, the challenge from the right in his own party. But the Olympics had been held in Montreal, and Ford wanted to welcome.
This is 1976.
This is 1976. Right. And Ford, the old jock, wanted to welcome the team back and congratulate them. But then he thought it would lend an extra element, almost a historic one, if he were to also invite Jesse Owens, the great Olympian from 1936. And he wanted to not just invite Owens, he wanted to give him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor that the country can hand out. And this was his attempt to compensate for a pretty shameful injustice that had been done to Jesse Owens 40 years earlier when he came back from the Olympics and was pointedly not invited to the Roosevelt White House, by the way, to which the rest of the Olympic team was invited. Anyway, it's those two stories, it seems to bracket the kind of man Gerald Ford was, and in a lot of and the kind of politics that he represented. And out of that, you can begin, I think, to tell the story of the kind of president that he was.
Right. I mean, it's very interesting because it feels like when you hear the moniker, the characterization, the party of Lincoln, yes, that was the birth of the Republican Party. And we're going back, obviously, all this, but audience is 1854. The party's born in Wisconsin, and it's essentially born to thwart the expansion of slavery into new territories, becoming states. But there's a great moment in the book where Gerald Ford is, I believe, a football player at the time at University of Michigan, and there was a black player on the team who the Southern opponents wouldn't play if he played. I can't remember his name right now.
Yeah, his name is Willis Ward.
Ward.
Ford's best friend on the team. They roomed together on the road.
Right.
And Georgia Tech was the team that said, we won't take the field if you insist on playing an African-American player. Willis Ward was the best player on the team.
Yeah.
And Ford thought about, and the Michigan, by the way, the university caved. And
cave being by not having the game if Willis played, you mean?
As a matter of fact, the athletic director at the time was the son of a Confederate veteran. So read what you will into that. In any event, long story, relatively short, Ward doesn't play. Ford thinks about quitting the team. Ward wants him to play, frankly, to beat Georgia Tech. Now, you got to remember, this was a terrible Michigan football team. They won one game that season. But the one game they won was against Georgia Tech.
Right.
And the highlight of the game, I think, comes early in the second half when a trash-talking Georgia Tech player comes up to the line of scrimmage and uses the N-word. Ford, who, together with a teammate on the very next play, knocks this guy out unconscious. They take him off the field in a litter. And Ford later tells Willis Ward, that one was for you. But the sequel to the story is what is extraordinary. Decades go by, Ford and Willis Ward remain friends. And Ward dies in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Ford dies in 2006.
Yeah.
An effort is made to put a statue of Ford as Michigan's representative in Statuary Hall. Republicans in the state Senate, they don't want to oppose it openly, but they drag their feet because there are people who have not forgiven Ford for his pro-affirmative action and pro-choice positions.
Yep.
At the critical moment when this thing is about to die, the Democratic minority leader of the Senate gets up, African-American senator from Detroit. He says, let me tell you something about Gerald Ford. And then he proceeds to tell them the story of Ford and Willis Ward. And at the end, he says, to a collective intake of breath, he identifies himself as Willis Ward's grandson. Well,
wow.
The statue is in the rotunda of the Capitol today, not far, by the way, from a statue of Ronald Reagan. And although Ford's position on affirmative action, although actually upheld by Sandra Day O'Connor's Supreme Court
in 2003,
overruled in a referendum in the state of Michigan in 2010.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's so one of the things I would always find fascinating as being just a presidential history geek through the years is sort of like, okay, well, were they governor, were they senator, were they congressman? Okay, so go back and pore over, how they voted on historic pieces of legislation. And I brought up the Willis Ward story for you to tell because it's at that point in the book where you quote Ford as saying, voting for civil and voting rights years later was going to be a no-brainer. I mean, he was already in tandem with that. And not unlike Bob Dole in Russell, Kansas, as a young congressman, these gentlemen were representing almost completely lily white districts for the most part and voting, for this sort of triumvirate of the Civil Rights Act as congressman, the Voting Rights Act 65, and then the Fair Housing Bill of 68, without cynicism and without it being any kind of ideological deal breaker. I mean, in many ways, that was kind of, I would think, crucial and central to their brand of kind of prairie republicanism. And it seemed, not to conflate Dolan here, but he did vote that way too.
No, absolutely. I give a story that actually illustrates even more starkly the risks, in effect, that Ford was willing to take right in the middle of this period. He's elected House Minority Leader. By the way, as an insurgent, he entered politics as an insurgent.
Yes.
Internationalist who knocked off an entrenched Republican isolationist incumbent.
Yeah. And this is 1948. He gets elected 3 years after the war, where he was in Democratic year where Truman beats Dewey, or Dewey beats Truman, although he didn't, right? And then and then Ford gets in 3 years after the war. He was a Navy man, World War II.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he had been an isolationist before the war.
Yeah.
Been involved with America First at Yale. But he underwent, like Arthur Vandenberg, his hometown political hero, he underwent a kind of road to Damascus conversion during the war. Okay. In 1965, once again, taking on the party establishment, he beats a guy from Indiana named Charlie Halleck, who was perfectly decent, but basically had kind of burned out in the job. So 1965, remember, is the year after the Goldwater debacle.
Yes.
But one thing that emerged from the Goldwater debacle were, at that time, some very lonely, pioneering Republican congressmen elected in states like Alabama and Mississippi. Right. They were obviously Goldwater Republicans.
Yeah.
They were not, I would say, Lincoln Republicans.
No.
They were more like John Wilkes Booth Republicans.
Right. Well, the tide is turning was after 64, right? The whole party shift begins over civil rights.
And the interesting thing, Ford wanted a Southern Republican Party, but the Southern Republican Party he envisioned was a party of Eisenhower and even more of Lincoln, more than Goldwater. Okay. Proof of that statement. 1965, the first Republican congressman in Mississippi since Reconstruction invites him to a dinner, fundraising dinner, the sort of thing that Ford would go to, in some cases, 100, 150 times a year, much to the regret of Mrs. Ford and his family. But in any event, he said, sure, I'll come. And then Charles Evers, the late brother of Medgar
Evers, right.
Recently deceased,
okay,
sends him a telegram that this dinner is going to be segregated. Ford undertakes an investigation, first of all, to make sure that's true. And when he learns that, in fact, that is the case, he makes it clear that that's not acceptable to him. He makes it furthermore clear that not only does he expect that the dinner will be integrated, but he expects tables at the dinner will be integrated. And the party in Mississippi comes up with this kind of lily-livered, quote, compromise, which is what they used to do when a figure of national prominence came to town during the 1960s. Right. And basically, he would come to the dinner would be segregated. He would, quote, arrive late, too late to give his formal remarks. But he would be seen, and then he would address an outdoor rally, which could be integrated. Ford said that wasn't good enough. Anyway, the dinner was canceled like 3 days before it was supposed to occur. This is the first Republican congressman, as I say, since Reconstruction.
Yeah.
This was a very high-profile event, and Ford took the risk, in effect, of alienating a whole lot of people by doing what he did. But that's Gerald Ford.
Yeah, I have a question actually, because I don't want to. In my lead up, I said to you that maybe ideologically it wasn't a risk. When a guy like Gerald Ford's a young congressman representing Grand Rapids,
right,
and he votes for all these civil rights bills, which is not. I don't think white Grand Rapids. I mean, I don't know. They was necessarily, Hattiesburg, Mississippi, but I don't know that they were necessarily demographically sympathetic. I don't know, but. Did he not, obviously he didn't pay a political price, but was there not opposition and hate mail and stuff for him going ahead and doing that? Or was it just an accepted thing because people had voted for Jerry kind of still believed in the sort of, I don't know, haloed idea of the party of Lincoln? Do you know? I didn't read anything about that. I was curious.
Yeah, no, he certainly always thought of himself as a Lincoln Republican. And in 1948, remember, he was also kind of a hero of the insurgency because his father and he both took on this machine,
the political machine in Grand Rapids.
And with the help from a lot of other folks. So he was, in effect, he was riding the crest of that wave. And he got the endorsement in 1948 of the UAW.
How do you like that?
So, one of the first things he does, well, interesting, just to kind of loop back, people may not realize he was not born Gerald Ford. He was born Leslie King.
You're my perfect segue. Let's go back to the beginning and let's talk about this young man and his formative years.
Yeah, I mean, he was, in many ways, he followed an unconventional path, certainly to the White House. Right. He was born in 1913.
Yeah.
Leslie King Sr., his father, was, by all accounts, a scoundrel.
Right.
Who 2 weeks after the birth of his son walked into his wife's bedroom with a butcher knife, threatening to kill both mother and son.
Right.
His wife, the future president's mother, remarkable woman, Dorothy King at that point, later Dorothy Ford, 2 days later slipped out of the house, got across the Mississippi to a train station in Iowa, took a train to Chicago where she had relatives. A divorce followed. And by the way, typical Wesley King Sr. never paid the court-ordered child support payments.
Yeah.
His father did for a while, but then he died. Anyway, the remarkable sequel to this is in the 1930s, when Ford is at Yale Law School, and this is long after divorce, and she's happily remarried, the mother of 3 additional sons.
Yeah.
She decides to take her former husband to court.
Right.
Over the unpaid child support. She wins multiple cases. At one point, she has him thrown into jail for a few hours. Anyway, but here's what comes from that. Ford's elected against all odds in 1948. One of the first pieces of legislation he introduces would, in effect, federalize child support. Would increase the penalties for non-payment, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Congress was not ready in 1949 to pass that. Fast forward a quarter century, 1975, one of the early pieces of legislation to cross his desk in the Oval Office is, in effect, an updated version of the bill that he introduced in 1949. And he signs it. But this is what is revealing. I mean, all of that's revealing.
Yeah, very.
He never mentions anything about his own story, his own connection to this issue. And that's one reason why I think, along with the Chevy Chase, stumbling, bumbling Saturday night caricature, it's one reason why, until now, people really have not known a lot about Ford. In some ways, he didn't want them, perhaps, to know a lot about him. In any event, and he came to the presidency with a congressional mindset.
Yes,
and that's the difference between legislative leadership, legislative persuasion.
Right,
is a night and day from what is required of the modern presidency. Ford had to learn all of that in very short order.
Yeah, I mean, you portray or you write about Ford or depict his life. I think it's an interesting takeaway. Like you said, people don't know much, both because he was so caricatured in the national media and by Chevy Chase, but also because of his own Midwestern reticence, you might say.
Good point.
Yeah. I mean, he was incredibly savvy, but never braggadocious. As I said earlier before we got, he was a canny political operator, but he wasn't a blowhard or a braggart. So a lot was, accomplished by Ford in his years as a legislator. And then as president, things he laid the groundwork for that I believe, if I'm not misspeaking, he didn't even trumpet that loudly on the 76 campaign trail. I mean, they're just things he did.
One footnote. The 76 campaign. He would not let his handlers promote or even mention the fact that in his youth he'd been a Sunday school teacher in Grand Rapids.
Right. Even though he's running against this Baptist, right.
Quite understandably,
was a Sunday school, right?
He was bringing a lot of sort of born again Christians into the political process.
You're right.
Ford reticence is a good word. His sister-in-law told Betty before the marriage,
right,
that he said, you don't have to worry. Jerry's mistress will never be another woman. It'll be his work.
Right. True.
And later on, in an interview that I found, the same woman said, Jerry is not demonstrative.
Mm-mm.
And she meant by that Mrs. Ford attributed that to Jerry's mother, who she referred to as businesslike. Who knows whatever it was, but there's no doubt Ford was the last person to blow his own horn. There's a point in the 76 campaign where they've gathered the people who are entrusted with doing the television campaign, Doug Bailey and John Deerdorf, brilliant political ad men who came up with some remarkable stuff in that campaign. And Dick Cheney is saying people don't know Jerry Ford, and at this point he'd been president for 2 years. And if they didn't know him in the summer of 1976, it's not surprising that almost 50 years later they don't know him.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a politics, a day in politics like a light year, as they always say, and the confluence of events that Jerry Ford was, or the maelstrom that he was swimming in, so to speak, right? You have, a post-Watergate era sort of Nixon disgrace. You've got stagflation, and all of that stuff. You got the whole 1970s after the Arab oil embargo, and then you've got us exiting Saigon, and I mean, it's just so many things. And then, after what felt like, at least the American electorate, 8 years of yuck and a very turbulent 60s, this sort of homespun one-term Georgia governor promises decency and civility in the White House, is the insurgent candidate, against
the classic outsider,
right?
An outsider who was
Jimmy Carter is who I'm speaking of, so the audience knows.
Stamped with small town values and obvious faith.
Right.
The interesting thing about the 76 campaign, if you look at the map, it's such a you can't even recognize it. I know, today, because Jimmy Carter carried every southern state except Virginia.
Right.
Ford, on the other hand, swept the Pacific coast.
Yeah.
He won New Jersey. He won Michigan. He won Connecticut. I mean, states that Republicans don't carry. But the other side of that coin is, if you stop to think, if you take the South out of the picture.
Yep.
In other words, if the Democrats had nominated anyone but Jimmy Carter,
right,
I would argue Ford would have won.
Yeah. Well, it was an incredibly narrow victory for the Carter-Mondale ticket anyway. I mean, Ohio pulled them over the top. But at that point, it's changed since, right? No Republican could win without winning Ohio.
No Republican has ever won the presidency without Ohio.
Right. And we saw Trump, lose Ohio in 2020 and subsequently lose the race, huh?
Yeah. And in fact,
win Ohio. Pardon me. He won Ohio and lost the race. That's what I meant. Yeah.
If 9,300 votes, if you could distribute them, and 9,300 and some change had changed hands on that election night, Ford would have won. In the Electoral College. He still would have lost the popular vote. It was an extraordinarily. Who would have thought that night, including either Carter or Ford, that they would go on to become very close friends.
Very close friends, right.
As close as Adams and Jefferson were in the last years of their lives.
Right.
And that's a great story.
That's a great story. Well, I want to go back to that in a second, but it's an interesting nugget of history that people should know about what Richard is talking about in terms of the map. We were joking before about that, you look at the blue for Jimmy Carter in 1976 all over the South, with the exception of Virginia. And of course, you see states like Alabama, Mississippi, and things that even Bill Clinton, who twice captured four or five southern states the first time, or five the second, Kentucky, Louisiana, Georgia, Tennessee, obviously Arkansas, never got Alabama, Mississippi, and then Carter carried Texas. Obviously was the last Democrat to do so, but Mississippi being a swing state, because Carter was religious, he began this sort of courtship of the quote unquote moral majority. I think I always argue Reagan cemented it, but Carter flirted with it and brought it in because he was Mr. Pious. And, he famously talked about having lust in his heart. That was one of his Jimmy Carter's moments, like a sinner. But Mississippi, Philadelphia, Mississippi, is where Ronald Reagan launched his presidential campaign on his states' rights premise, because he knew that they had to cut into that Carter Southern, cartel, if you will, which weirdly enough had voted for Goldwater in 64, right? Wallace in 68.
Yeah.
Nixon 72. It wasn't even like the South of the 1930s, which if there was an R by your name, you were persona non grata. It's interesting. So Mississippi still being in play is as late as 1980. Of course, by then it's all history, so to speak. But just interesting how those states could have been in play.
Carter carried Mississippi by 11,000 votes.
Right. Yeah.
So it was a paper thin. The interesting thing about the South also was if the Democrats had nominated anyone other than Jimmy Carter, then it's highly likely Ford would have gone with Howard Baker as his running mate.
Okay, let's go to that for a second. Is that what did the president know and when did he know it? Right, yeah. Senator from Tennessee, another moderate Republican.
There wasn't any particular personal chemistry between Ford and Baker. Whereas with Dole, first of all, they'd been in the House together for years.
Sure. Dole
delivered the Kansas delegation in January 1965 that made Ford minority leader.
There you go.
Over Charlie Halleck. They had a real relationship. Why did he pick Dole? Largely process of elimination. The fact of the matter is, Stu Spencer, the great political strategist from California, the Reaganite who actually helped to manage Ford's campaign brilliantly in 76 in the primaries and beyond. He argued, I think, shrewdly, look, you got a problem with your base. Right now, the agricultural, the farm states in this country,
right?
You could look at them on the map, which ordinarily would be solid Republican,
right?
Are not, and you've got to nail down your base before you do anything else. Well, Bob Dole, was obviously Mr. Agriculture.
Of course,
he also had a big following among veterans.
Yeah,
he'd been Republican national chairman. He was one of the few people who, although he was for Ford, had managed throughout the primary campaign not to alienate, the Reagan supporters. I mean, there was a huge job, which I would argue was never completely achieved after that very divisive convention of uniting the party, of bringing the Reagan people back in. And the fact of the matter is, Ford, I think, went to his grave resenting Reagan's failure to campaign for him in places like Mississippi and Texas and Southern California, as he had been asked.
Hey, I don't know if I go to my grave with it, but I do too, because for a number of reasons, which your book expertly outlines, but for my own personal politics, I sure wish Jerry Ford had won 76. It's one of those, you can play counterfactual history and think of all the things we might not have had because of it. I'm still of the belief, though, certainly I have in presidential politics only clicked or pulled the lever for Democrats just because of my choices. But I definitely think, despite being a good man, Jimmy Carter was really a weak president. And I think there's a lot of history trying to spin that. And to me, I probably would have voted for Reagan in 80 had I been old enough. I was 6 years old, because there was just a lot about the Carter administration, I think, that got a lot of things wrong.
Well, the interesting thing is how much of the agenda of the Carter administration had actually been foreshadowed by Ford.
Right.
Ford's
deregulation.
Ford's popular image, is the caretaker, the appointed president, who cleaned up messes that he had inherited from Nixon. Obviously, the Watergate aftermath, including the pardon, Vietnam, the rogue CIA, we forget. The first several.
That's the Frank Church committee.
Church
right.
Committee.
Yeah.
But one of the real surprises of this book, and it surprised me as I got further into it, was how much Ford initiated.
Right.
And I would argue Ford's claims to being a consequential president, historically significant, even relevant, rest much less on what he did to restore trust in the presidency, significant as that was. And by the way, that's what he went to his grave believing would be his historical legacy. But the fact is, just you mentioned Helsinki.
Yeah.
The Helsinki Accords in 1975 at the time were severely criticized from the right and the left.
Yeah. Tell us why.
As a concession to the Soviet Union, acknowledging the legitimacy of their empire in Eastern Europe. We now know, of course, that they were, in fact, a milestone on the road leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of that empire. But a year before that, Ford had always believed in what we would call economic deregulation. He was shrewd enough, again, it gets back to your point about his political canniness. He knew that that was a loser as a title. He called it regulatory reform.
Right.
And the idea was, he brought out, there was this marvelous scene where he brought the 10 heads of the independent regulatory agencies to the East Room, not to read them the Riot Act or give them orders, because he couldn't do that, but to ask questions. And basically, do we really need an interstate commerce commission, created under Grover Cleveland?
Right.
Et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Do we need the federal government setting telephone rates? I mean, on and on.
Right.
You get the picture. But he didn't just ask questions. He sent people up to the Hill to talk to Ted Kennedy. He said, I want to find out what the limits of bipartisanship are on this issue. And it turned out he was able, in his short presidency, to deregulate the railroads and the financial services agency. But more important, he wrote legislation that basically was taken up by the Carter administration to deregulate the airlines and more. And then the Reagan administration picked up where the Carter administration left off. So it became a bipartisan, something that we take for granted. Try to tell a young person today that not so long ago, Washington, D.C. decided where you could get a home mortgage or where a plane could fly or what a trucker could carry. All of that is history, but it began with Gerald Ford.
That's right. And thankfully with, I think Gerald Ford, thankfully for that, Gerald Ford sits suspended between two polar ideologies, in my opinion. Okay. And I'm only going to use Carter as an example. Now I know Carter wouldn't be considered progressive by today's standards, but I'm going to say there's Carter on the leftish, and then you've got the whole Reagan social conservatism, burn down the government, though they didn't, though that was their classic claim, but they didn't. And then you have Gerald Ford as the ultimate dirty moderate, a guy who says, right, the government should provide a floor. Like Eisenhower reconciled himself to the New Deal. We need a social safety net. To not have one is just, quite frankly, Dickensian nonsense and cruel. Okay. However, there is a way in which a legislator who voters choose to take a quote unquote center right position that can go to Washington or go to their session locally or wherever they are, especially in Washington, and prune the budgets and look for places to save the taxpayer money and to say, hey, you can believe the federal government has a role to play without believing that each and every bill is full of lard, full of giveaways, and also implicated with this notion that the government has to do everything when it absolutely doesn't in a country predicated on federalism.
Yeah.
Is that a fair analysis?
Well, yeah. I mean, Ford used to say, I heard him, consensus is not a dirty word.
No.
Compromise is not surrender.
Nope.
And pragmatism is the key to getting things done. Now, that's sort of unglamorous in the conventional sense.
Yeah.
But Ford was all about getting things done. He was a transactional president. He wasn't a visionary. But then, in 1974, as someone said, we weren't sure that we'd have a country, or at least a democratic country. you know, 2 years hence when we observed our bicentennial. The contrast between the summer of 74 and the summer of 76 suggests that Ford got some things done, that he cooled the overheated political climate, and that he drew off a lot of the poisons from not only Watergate, but Vietnam as well. I mean, to me, the most difficult part of this book to write,
yeah,
and it went through many drafts, and each one of them was painful, was the last 24 hours in Saigon, which is a story that has never really been told from Ford's perspective. And
well, let's dive into it in light of the Biden Afghanistan chaos.
Well, yeah, I mean,
because people were regularly invoking the fall of Saigon at the time of Biden's exit as a, well, some people rightfully said it's not exactly an analog by any means, but there is a lesson to be had in messy exits. Let's talk about that.
Well, yeah, well, and the assumption is it was a failure,
right?
But in fact, the story is
right.
It would have been a hell of a lot bigger failure if Ford had not gotten his way by using the bully pulpit and shaming Congress into reversing itself and voting money to bring in the first wave 130,000 Vietnamese refugees to this country.
Yeah.
I think it's Ford's finest hour.
Uh-huh.
Following what may have been his worst hour. I mean, certainly from his own standpoint, I heard him describe the sense of humiliation of being in the Oval Office and watching the United States, in effect, get kicked out of Indochina after 25 years and countless lives and treasure. But those 24 hours told from within the Oval Office, as you've got these fissures. James Schlesinger, the Secretary of Defense, violently disagreeing with Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State. Kissinger wants to bring out more Vietnamese. Schlesinger doesn't, frankly, really seem to care a whole lot about bringing out Vietnamese. Ford is presiding over this. By the way, nobody planned on a helicopter evacuation.
Isn't that interesting?
Plan number 4. The plan always was to have fixed wing aircraft taking off in an orderly process from Tan Son Nhut Airport. Well, when the airport came under shelling, and basically the timeline, if you will, was moved up, they had no choice but to go with the helicopters. It was supposed to be a 3-hour operation. It turned into 18 hours, and there were thousands of people who climbed that staircase on the top of the embassy. And here again, revealing of Ford, years later, a trustee of the Ford Library Foundation was in the former Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. The U.S. Embassy had not yet been torn down, and he could see from street level the ladder. And one thing led to another, and the ladder was brought to America, to the Ford Museum, where it's displayed today. Henry Kissinger thought it was a terrible idea. Why would anyone want to remind people of this national humiliation? And Ford's response was classic Ford. He said, first of all, it's history.
Yeah.
We can't afford to forget it.
Right.
But secondly, with a little bit of vision that he wasn't often credited with, Ford said that ladder represents a desire for freedom.
Yes.
Every bit as much as that chunk of the Berlin Wall that we display out front. And I want to say, 99 was the 25th anniversary.
Right, 75.
2000.
2000.
Anniversary of the fall of Saigon. Ford came back to Grand Rapids from California to dedicate the ladder before a crowd of 500 Vietnamese Americans who had settled in West Michigan, many of them sponsored by churches in this area. By the way, many of them since have left for California.
They're in Orange County, the biggest.
Where the climate is much more reminiscent of Vietnam itself. But in any event, they were here for, it was obviously a bittersweet occasion.
Yeah.
But it was obviously also incredibly moving. There are Vietnamese Americans today who look at Ford as their president.
Sure.
Because if he hadn't been president, and if he hadn't done what he did in the immediate aftermath of the fall of Saigon, the odds are they never would have escaped.
Do you think that because media images in history are unreliable, they get these images get frozen in amber, so to speak, and you only think of it as one way. Do we, Ford bringing over the 160,000 Vietnamese people, do we think that the exit or the operation of that exit was more successful than had been portrayed, but that the images are invariably messy and fraught and like Afghanistan, whether you agree with it or not? Look, I'm glad we got out of Vietnam. I didn't want to necessarily do it that way. I'm glad we're out of Afghanistan, and I am far from an isolationist. But I think Ford had a skepticism about Vietnam all along anyway, didn't he? I mean,
he did. And interestingly enough, he would bring the same skepticism many years later to the Iraq invasion. He distinguished between Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yes.
And he said, look, I understand freedom and the desire for freedom.
Yeah.
But he said basically the overriding factor in foreign policy, particularly the projection of American military power, has got to be very simply, is this in the United States' interest?
Yeah.
Interest has to trump, in effect, everything else. And I think lots of people were disappointed, to put it mildly, embarrassed, whatever you want to say, when the weapons of mass destruction didn't turn up, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it was awkward for Ford because, of course, he was Rumsfeld and Cheney.
Yep, we're in the White House.
His guys.
Yeah.
He remained very close to them to the end of his life. He had been very close to the Bush family.
Oh, yeah.
George W. Bush and Laura Bush were very kind to him. On his 90th birthday, they had a party at the White House, and so this issue I don't think ever intruded on the personal relationship, but he had a healthy skepticism.
He had a healthy skepticism. What's important about his skepticism, because he really was. I believe Ford to have been a great institutionalist and, like you mentioned, a pragmatist and a man who, it sounds a little, it can sound a little bit sentimental, but a love of country. He gets thrust into the vice presidency because Agnew has to resign due to graft and extortion, all this stuff. Former Governor of Maryland, Spiro Agnew, who was on Nixon's ticket. Ford is there for 8 months. He hates every minute of it. This is where I'm going with this. Conventional wisdom has long had it that Ford pardoning Nixon, our long national nightmare is over, as he put it, spelled doom for his electoral chances in 76. Do you think that is true?
It's interesting. The reason,
or do you think it has merit? Not that we have to, doesn't be so reductive, but is that?
I think it's more complicated than that. And the reason
as is everything, and that's why we're dirty moderates.
Right? I mean, first of all, yes, the polls reflected popular disapproval. On the other hand, there are times months later when Ford's poll numbers are up significantly. And so I think the pardon may have been a justification that some people had. I think at the very end of the campaign, Ford had caught up to Carter. And in a curious way, Doug Bailey, the campaign strategist, outlined this, and I think there's a lot to it. In some ways, Ford catching up to Carter changed the equation for undecided voters, because as long as Ford was trailing, then the spotlight was on Carter. And Doug Bailey's theory was, in this campaign, if the spotlight's on Carter, Ford has a chance to win. If on election day voters go to the polls and the preeminent choice is, does Gerald Ford deserve 4 more years in the White House, then Carter will probably win. If, on the other hand, the voter is saying, do I know enough about Jimmy Carter to be comfortable with him, then Ford would win. And in an odd way, 2 things happen. First of all, Ford, in effect, caught up in the polls.
Yeah.
But more important, there were some economic numbers released at the last weekend of the campaign that threw doubt on Ford's claims. The fact of the matter is he had cut inflation in half.
Right.
The unemployment rate was coming down, but it blipped up at the worst possible moment.
Yeah.
And of course, in the supercharged media climate of the last weekend of a close presidential campaign, you can be sure what led the headlines. And so I think at the very end of the campaign, and intangible, this question that Doug Brinkley described about Ford and another 4 years.
Yeah.
And a tangible in terms of the economy combined to provide that wafer thin margin in places like Ohio and Hawaii.
And because this all too well, presidential elections start early, maybe not as early as they do now, but they begin early. There are a number of what ifs and contingencies which we can never prove. But to your point earlier, Reagan didn't campaign from in certain swing states. I'm taking the pardon out of this for a second. I know he took a lot of flack for the 76 debate. There's no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Obviously, he knew that, but didn't mean that. It was a clumsy way of saying it.
And he made it worse. Ford was a very stubborn guy.
Yeah.
The public didn't see it often.
Right.
But he said famously that the one thing he inherited from his birth father was a temper. And he spent a lifetime controlling it. But he was very stubborn. And he dug his heels in.
Right.
The biggest mistake he made was not just in prematurely liberating Poland, but in absolutely refusing for 3 days to acknowledge that he made a mistake.
Exactly.
And he paid a high price. But here's the fascinating thing. Like everyone who thinks about this, I assume, gosh, that must have been a real turning point. At the very least, it stopped the momentum that he had.
Well, I'm speculating it had to have had some effect.
Yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing.
Yeah.
I found the NBC News poll.
Yeah.
Taken a week after.
Yeah.
When this thing had reverberated. And the fact of the matter is that Ford had further cut into Carter's lead.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things, like the Playboy interview that you mentioned.
Yeah.
That was this great.
That Carter gave Lust in My Heart. You talking
Lust in My Heart, exactly.
Yeah.
This feeding frenzy. And guess what? Within a couple of nights, they had the first debate. It never came up because the public, even then, was more sophisticated than perhaps some journalists gave them credit. They could tell the difference between a 24-hour and issues that affected their lives.
Well, I think it was in many ways a healthier republic because disinformation always has existed in the country, as have what I always say now is what Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American politics, but everybody didn't have a 24-hour megaphone. So things could happen, right? Evening news covered it. There might be a Sunday program, but people weren't chewing on it either. You see in contemporary times where, we've gone from, Trump went on CNN. He shouldn't go on CNN. Well, now he should have, but the audience was rigged. But now it was a good idea. Now I'm not watching CNN because there's just too much information being thrown at people.
Entirely too much media.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. And so I think we had people reading newspapers in a different way, and I do believe that you had stalwart journalists, right? When this from Cronkite, go to, John Chancellor. List all the people of that era, who gave you the news, and people could take the news and sure, there were always Birchers reading their right-wing stuff, but
ultimately it also mattered that you had two fundamentally decent men
You did.
who were running for,
Yeah.
and although while they obviously worked up a lather, you know, by election day, the weekend before the election,
Yeah.
classic Ford story.
Yeah.
A publicity-seeking pastor, African American, showed up at Jimmy Carter's church in Plains,
Right.
which did not admit him.
No.
And this was immediately suspected to be a Republican dirty trick. And I found an interview with someone who had the conversation with Ford on the campaign plane, who had just been told about this. And Ford says to Jim Baker, I hope none of our people were involved with this. And forgive me, it may not have been Jim Baker, but he said to someone on the plane, it may have been Dick Cheney. In any event, someone in a position to act upon his orders. He repeated himself. He said, if anyone on our side is involved in this, I will take care of them personally. And again, it's the fundamental, call it Midwestern decency.
Yep. Yeah.
But it had its counterpart, in small town Southern decency.
It did.
And nostalgia is misleading.
It is.
But
I think, and Richard, I could talk to you forever, but we are going to have to wrap up. But I want to say to your point, and I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll go.
Yeah.
Nostalgia is misleading, but I think that what you just illustrated was something that's very much at work in a country of our size. Regional culture matters.
Yeah.
It isn't all, everything now is you're my enemy. Everything's an ideology. No, the Midwestern decency is a thing. Southern hospitality is a thing. It's not always linked to politics. It's the way America is made up of so many different little countries. And oftentimes our leaders who come from those places reflect that. Oftentimes they flout it. Other times they dismiss it, dependingly. It just depends on where they're from. Here's what I want to ask you, though, before we go. What did you learn the most from writing about Gerald R. Ford? What was the most important thing you think you took away? I shouldn't say
that he's a much more consequential president than I had suspected, or that I think probably most historians assume. That he was much more, his presidency was much less a coda to Richard Nixon's presidency than it is a curtain raiser to what follows. And that's pretty significant.
Pretty significant. Yeah. And on that note, I want to make sure that everybody reads Richard's book. Again, this is Richard Norton Smith, who wrote An Ordinary Man, The Surprising Life and Historic Presidency of Gerald R. Ford. Indeed, it was historic and surprising. And as Richard pointed out, he was no interregnum just between Nixon and Carter. Those brief years of Jerry Ford in the White House have indeed proved consequential, and for my money, the last of the true Eisenhower Republicans. And we are so far afield from that now, but I think a decent, honorable man who made Americans, and I still believe this, persuaded by the idea that a center-right but deeply constitutional perspective about the United States has validity, viability, and should never be dismissed or sidelined, because we miss it so much now in our hyper-polarized, I argue, cesspool of a time. Richard, listen, thanks for writing this book. Thank you for joining. And I am now going to go read everything you've ever written, because I haven't. And please, you're welcome back anytime. You have reminded us, most important, that Gerald Ford was a dirty moderate.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for joining us. All right, dirty moderates, as always, stay dirty, stay moderate, and stay safe.